News Saturday. From New York, here's Peter Jennings.
Good evening. This is the third night of the war in the Middle East. There are many more to come, but perhaps tonight Israelis will sleep a little better. There's been an urgent effort today to improve Israel's security. The U.S., at Israeli request, has rushed a shipment of the Patriot interceptor missiles to Israel, along with American servicemen to operate them. It isn't a guarantee that Iraqi rockets will not reach Israel again tonight, but it has, at least for the moment, kept Israel from attacking Iraq. The Allied air campaign against Iraq and occupied Kuwait goes on. Bad weather makes it difficult to assess the results today, and it is impossible to understand how many Iraqis are being killed in the incessant bombing. We begin with a report from Sam Donaldson, who's in Saudi Arabia.
There's a growing urgency here to find Iraq's Scud missiles and take them all out. These F-111s from a Red Sea base in Saudi Arabia have been flying against them all day. The political and psychological effect on the war of continued attacks on Israel is worrying U.S. commanders. At the Pentagon,
we are conducting reconnaissance. We have aircraft up. We are covering the area constantly. We have Scud watches going on in theater and other places. And we think that eventually we will be successful and reduce the Scud threat.
The round-the-clock bombing raids against Scud launchers, when they can be found, and other targets continue. Here a French Jaguar takes aim at a hangar and ammunition dump and scores. There is Iraqi resistance, down to lone gunners firing from Baghdad rooftops. And there is the loss of another U.S. plane to report. According to the latest accounting released by the U.S. military in Riyadh, 6 U.S. planes have been lost to date. 2 Navy, 2 Air Force, and 1 Marine. One of them lost outside of a combat area. Iraq is said to have lost 10 planes so far in air-to-air combat. How many on the ground cannot be measured precisely. The pilots fighting the air war reflect high morale.
Just like a training sortie, almost. My heart didn't think it was, but it went good.
We saw some air-to-air, and we saw some ground-air, and we saw a lot of AAA, and we worked for our money last night.
And the ground crews are truly gung-ho. This bomb says, Hussein, if Allah doesn't answer, ask for Jesus. And this one, for all you do, this bomb's for you. The first Iraqi prisoners of war were captured today from an anti-aircraft platform in the Persian Gulf off the coast of Kuwait. The USS Nichols neutralized the platform and took off 12 prisoners. And for the first time today, U.S. and Iraqi ground patrols clashed in skirmishes on the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. Apparently nothing protracted, and there are no reports of casualties. But the encounters follow sporadic artillery fire from the Iraqi side.
In some areas it's accurate. It should be accurate because they've had plenty of time to survey the targets in.
Despite all that, the Marines sound upbeat and ready to go.
Oh, and the Scuds come flying in. Oh, and the Scuds come flying in.
High spirits aside, Pentagon officials say that the focus of the air war has moved now toward bombarding Iraqi troop concentrations and away from the heart of industrialized Iraq. And elements of the 82nd Airborne have been moved into forward positions here. So the days for singing in the foxhole may soon be over. The generals are clearly preparing for the next phase of this war, the ground battle. Peter?
Sam, at the Pentagon briefings today, there was a hint that their bomb damage assessment was not going very well because of weather. Is that reflected on the ground?
Well, there's heavy weather over western Iraq, as you know, Peter. This has hampered trying to find the Scud missile launchers, the mobile launchers that can be hidden so well, the ones that have attacked Israel. And without aerial reconnaissance, you can't really assess the damage. So I think that's correct. Here, there's a problem of trying to find out precisely what targets need to be hit again and which ones can be passed over.
Okay, Sam, thanks very much. By the way, tomorrow on This Week with David Brinkley, the guest will be General Norman Schwarzkopf, who is the Supreme Allied Commander in Saudi Arabia. A Pentagon briefer also said today that the military now has the authority to activate nearly 200,000 more military reserves and extend others already in the Gulf. The problem is skills. Some of the highly specialized reservists are coming to the end of their time, and the military needs to keep them. The Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, was among those who briefed the President up at Camp David today. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Colin Powell, was there as well. Mr. Bush was on the phone 3 times today with the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. ABC's Dean Reynolds is in Israel tonight, and here is his report on the harrowing experience the Israelis have had and the relief that may be in sight.
It was without a doubt the most welcome sight all week. A huge U.S. Air Force cargo plane bringing American-made Patriot missile defense batteries to Israel. Accompanied by American military advisors, the Patriot system was being made operational tonight as quickly as possible. The Patriot proved this week in Saudi Arabia that it can shoot down an incoming Iraqi Scud missile. But its range is small. An incoming missile will be closing on its target before it can be intercepted, if at all. And if Iraq arms one of its Al-Hussein Scud missiles with a chemical warhead, there is no guarantee that exploding it will keep toxic material from contaminating the ground below. The Patriot batteries arrived after the second Iraqi attack on Israel this week. This one, like the attack on Thursday, didn't kill anyone, though the damage to buildings was extensive. This morning, Israelis were digging out of the rubble and still resisting the impulse to retaliate, at least for now.
We have never committed ourselves to an automatic response. We always try to make a clever response.
The arrival of the American missile advisors is significant. It is the first time Israel has ever let members of a foreign army defend it. But the situation here is unique, and now there is no time to waste. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, Jerusalem.
Joining us briefly this evening with his observations, one of our resident military analysts, Tony Cordesman, who's in Washington. Mr. Cordesman, on the basis of what you've heard today, and however many Scuds the Iraqis may have left, what do you think the threat is now to Israel and also to American forces in Saudi Arabia from Iraqi missiles?
Well, we're talking about three different types of missiles, and it's interesting to note that each would present a different threat. The regular Scud doesn't present any threat at all. Another, called the Al-Hussein, can cover most of Israel, but it does not have a high payload warhead. It probably does not have significant chemical capabilities. And finally, we're talking about a third missile called the Al-Abbas, which is still relatively experimental, may be based on fixed launchers, but could deliver a major chemical warhead if it survives. From what we've heard very quickly, there are only about 30 fixed sites at most, perhaps 30 to 40 mobile sites. The implication is that a lot of those have already been destroyed, and the risk is very much reduced over the last few days.
Now, talk briefly a little bit, if you would, about what appears to be a slight shift in the campaign from a purely air war to an air, slightly land campaign.
Well, an important figure was issued today. We're now up to 560,000 men. That indicates our buildup is pretty well complete. It's also clear that they've shifted to attacking the forces in Iraq, in Kuwait, and southern Iraq, the 35 divisions there with concentration on the Republican Guards. That could last a long time. There are tens of thousands of individual targets, but it's obvious we now have the air superiority over that region to begin destroying their ground forces sortie by sortie.
Tony Cordesman in Washington, thank you for joining us again. In a moment, what the war is doing to Baghdad, the peace movement in the United States at the gates of the White House today, and the Europeans, part of the coalition, but very nervous. Has been what we cannot tell you at the moment is how extensive the Iraqi casualties are, how many Iraqis are actually dying, or the precise extent of the damage, because we simply do not know. The information flow is going to get worse. Iraq has now ordered all foreign journalists out of the country. ABC's Gary Shepard was in Iraq until yesterday. He's now in Jordan.
The American Air Force has been back over Baghdad time and time again. These pictures of the second night of bombing were driven by car out of Iraq. This building near the downtown district was hit by an American Tomahawk cruise missile. It sustained substantial damage. The airstrikes have not yet destroyed all of Baghdad's radar, and anti-aircraft batteries are still operating, but they have not been able to stop the American bombers from hitting other targets. This communications tower took heavy damage during the second round of bombing. Telephone service for the average Iraqi is now difficult, if not impossible. Electricity has been cut off in much of the Iraqi capital. Water supplies have been disrupted, and so has sanitation. Some refugees from the air attacks have already reached the Jordanian border. This man says he suffered a head wound when the building next to his apartment was hit. Radio Baghdad has been issuing urgent appeals to all Iraqi citizens, asking them to capture and turn in any American pilots who might be shot down, turn them into the Army. The reward, the equivalent of 30,000 American dollars. Peter?
Gary, we've heard Radio Baghdad invoking people to rise up against Americans, but has there been any hint on the radio as to how bad it is for Iraqi civilians throughout the country?
None whatsoever, Peter. They are trying desperately to minimize any negative information that might come out of Iraq. They're trying to put their best foot forward to the rest of the world. They wanted the American journalists to stay. Most of us left because of the danger from the war, and finally they've kicked the rest of the foreign journalists out. So I suspect there'll be very little information, negative information, coming out of Iraq.
While you were in Baghdad, you could give us some grasp of what was going on in that city, but what as you worked your way northwest to Jordan? What was it like for Iraqi civilians as you came along the way?
Well, we didn't see a terribly large number of Iraqi citizens, occasional people driving on the roads. The roads were almost deserted, and we hit 3 air attacks along the way, so most of the civilians were keeping out of sight.
Okay, Gary Shepard in Amman, the Jordanian capital this evening. Thank you. One of today's targets was an Iraqi communication center just inside Kuwait. It was destroyed, apparently, by American forces using a British-designed jet called the Harrier. ABC's Jim Hickey has been with some of the troops who fly those jets out of a base in Saudi Arabia.
Marine Harrier jets roared skyward from eastern Saudi Arabia today. Their mission, eliminate enemy positions prior to an American ground assault on the army of Saddam Hussein.
In preparation for the predicted movement into Kuwait, we are taking out his fire support, particularly his long-range fire support.
That means bombing trenches, bunkers, and artillery batteries along the Saudi Arabian-Kuwaiti border, places where U.S. troops will be most vulnerable. The Harriers and their pilots are on a rotating 24-hour alert status. That means they can be airborne within 15 minutes to go after targets of opportunity. Today, for example, the pilot of an OB-10 Bronco observation plane located in Iraqi Communication Center. It is suspected of directing artillery fire at U.S. forces, wounding some of them this week.
Once we located it, then we were able to mark the grid and pass it on so that they can bring in the air to take that target out.
The grid, or location, was passed on to a Harrier squadron, which took off and, with assistance from another Bronco pilot, attacked.
He says, do you see the radio antennas on top of the building? I said, I have it cleared hot, and we all dropped.
And what happened to the tower?
It and a good deal of the surrounding area disappeared.
The Harrier, designed to provide close air support for troops on the ground, is another one of those sophisticated weapon systems never tested by Americans in combat. That test is just beginning. Jim Hickey, ABC News, in Saudi Arabia.
We'll continue this special edition about the war in just a moment. There's been a great deal of speculation about whether the Arab nations in the international coalition against Iraq, namely Egypt and Syria, would stay in if the war involved the Israelis or if the war's objectives were widened to include a land attack against Iraq. The war is also a very sensitive subject in Europe. ABC's Jim Bitterman is in France.
The early Allied victories have brought Europeans not joy, but jitters. There has been so much Middle East terrorism here. Every discarded box now merits the attention of the bomb squad and raises the fear that that far-off desert storm will bring a downpour of attacks. Europe is home to 8 million people who are not Western and Christian, but Middle Eastern and Muslim. Saddam Hussein's claims that the war is religious and ethnic have had impact, creating countless Iraqi sympathizers with European nationality, and adding to the ranks of the continent's others who question the wisdom of spilling blood for oil. The ambiguities at home about the war extend to the Gulf itself, where the European allies limit their troops' involvement. Italian pilots can't bomb Iraq, and neither could the French until this morning, when their defense minister said bombing Iraq is okay so long as the only goal remains Kuwait's liberation. 3 days after the fighting in the Gulf started, some in Europe are as concerned about what happens after the war as during it. There are proposals for a post-war conference to seriously address the Middle East never-ending conflicts. For now, Europe's defense and foreign ministers who met in Paris this week remained firmly committed to freeing Kuwait. But they want it done with minimum damage to Iraq and to their relations with the Arab world. Jim Bitterman, ABC News, Paris.
In some of the other news today, a report from the Soviet Union that 7 of Mikhail Gorbachev's liberal advisors have been dropped from his ruling circle. Among them, according to the independent news agency Interfax, is Evgeny Primakov, who was Mr. Gorbachev's senior advisor on the Middle East. Eastern Airlines has begun laying off its employees. The airline has 18,000 workers. It shut down completely last night, $3 billion in debt. Eastern's court trustee says he is still trying to sell the airline, either whole or plane by plane. He also says that all tickets will be refunded. We'll be back in a moment.